Did the 39mm Rolex Explorer reference 214270, so the previous generation one, did that inspire the Tudor Ranger, the new one? That's what we're going to cover in this video. To begin with, I'd like to give a thanks to Ken Watches for the hands-on experience of the Explorer, and thanks to Watchden for the shots of the Ranger. I went to an AD to film the Ranger, but they didn't let me. So this is what we have right now. So first off, let's compare the specifications of the two watches. The Tudor Ranger and Explorer 214270, they both have a stated diameter of 39mm. That's the whole inspiration behind this video. It seems to clearly be Rolex trying to replicate the watch that they did discontinue by reintroducing the same 39mm. But the other thing to remember is that the Black Bay 58 also has a 39mm case, and so it's either of these two things, and we're going to take a closer look. So both watches are 39mm, but that does not imply that they wear the same or the cases are the same. The cases are not the same. In fact, Black Bay case versus Oyster case on the Explorer. So in terms of lug to lug length, this distance on a watch, the Explorer comes in at 47mm, whereas the Tudor Ranger comes in at close to 48mm, 47.7. Those are the estimates I've seen. I've not measured it myself. So very similar in terms of the overall size in which it would wear on a wrist, because the lug-to-lug length is kind of what decides whether a watch fits well on someone's wrist or not, typically, along with the construction of the lugs and the curvature. Sometimes that's also important. But this is one of the main features, I'd say, more important than the diameter. So moving on to the thickness. The thickness is one of the more important differentiating characteristics between Rolex and Tudor, and it's always kind of been this way with the modern watches, where they've not shared the same case like back in the old days. So Rolex has always been more refined, by that I mean thinner, and Tudor's always been kind of thick, and that's been a sticking point with a lot of the watches. Starting off with the regular Black Bay in 41mm, that's a really thick watch. The Black Bay Pro that just released, a lot of the conversation around that watch is all about the thickness. And of course, the use of a dome crystal doesn't particularly help this fact, but even the case thickness alone is greater than Rolex, and people are not that pleased with that. So the Explorer comes in at 11mm thick, but it's got a flat sapphire crystal. The Tudor Ranger also is supposedly 11mm thick, but I think that does not count the dome crystal. I think with the dome crystal, it's very similar to a Black Bay. So I'd estimate in the region of 12.5mm thick. The general case design is not geometrically the same, but in terms of purpose behind the design, I think it kind of is. The Ranger is like a more rudimentary specification of the same thing. Kind of like when a vehicle is also offered in like a military or commercial specification. So everything inside is Spartan and basic. It's not the same thing, but you can make that comparison. To compare this to the watch itself, well, the entire construction is brushed. Typically, even brushed Rolex watches have a polished side case profile, whereas this whole thing is brushed. And the similarity to Rolex is the fact that it also comes with the Oyster-styled links, and a lot of the design cues are based on the Explorer. So now let's talk about the most important facet, the dial. The Ranger has been on the receiving end of a lot of flack regarding negative space on the dial, meaning the dial is large and there isn't much going on relative to how large it is. I completely disagree with this. I think it's a great size. The stock photos online make it look like a dinner plate, but it's not the case. In person, it seems much more proportionate. The dome bezel might also be a factor, adding to the perceived magnification of the negative space. You have to realize like the angle at which you look at it is quite important, because it does sort of magnify some regions. If this were a 41mm watch, then I would certainly understand the qualms of it having negative space and not a good use of space essentially. But it's 39 and I think it's well executed. The fact that the bezel is rather thin also perhaps accentuates the negative space, but I like the thin bezel. I don't like those thick polished bezels. I'm not saying that the one on the Explorer is bad. The one on the Explorer is actually really nice and proportionate, but still it's polished, and I'm not sure if I would have preferred it to be brushed. So what about the Explorer 214270? Also perfect dimensions. I think it's much more sophisticated than the Ranger. That's a combination of many things. Just the flat profile of the entire watch, the fact that they use a flat crystal, I like that more. I'm not the biggest fan of the dome crystal on the Tudor Ranger. Apart from that, the case design itself, the Oyster case, is a better case design than the Black Bay case. I feel that way. I do think the integration of the lugs, the bracelet, the taper, I think it works a little bit better on the 214-270. I really like those proportions. And the bracelet is also a bit more refined. Actually quite a lot more refined than on the Tudor Black Bay. But the clasp is where the Black Bay has an upper hand. The T-fit system is quite nice, and it's really modern and precise, and that's a fun juxtaposition on this vintage retro inspired watch. It makes a lot of sense that they did that. I don't think it's out of place. It's on the underside of the watch. I think that's what you want. If you want a vintage inspired watch, you don't want it to have all the clunkiness of the older watches, and it doesn't. That's pretty great. Now, in terms of the hands themselves, Mercedes hands. I like the Mercedes hands on the Submariner. Do I like it on the Explorer? It's nice. I wouldn't say I dislike it, but it might have been more interesting to see something else, something that would differentiate the Explorer a bit more. Now the 214-270, it's the basic Explorer. It's the Rolex that does not intend to look like a Rolex. It has no flair, and that's what's special about it. That's what people want from it. If you wanted a more fancy Explorer, something that catches the eye, you would go for the Explorer 2. That's why that's there in the range. But comparing these two watches, the Ranger and the Explorer, the Ranger just has a bit more flair. The use of the red accent on the tip of the second hand, I like that. The thing I don't like is the way they change the general shape of the hands compared to the watch that this Ranger is actually based on, which is the 34mm Tudor Ranger from back in the day, reference 7995. This is the 79950, so it's pretty clear that they intend this to be a revision of that watch. But that watch was a 34mm watch, and those hands, they're so much more precise, they're sharp. I like that a lot more than these hands. They took the same hands and they just made it a little bit more curved in a kind of weird manner, especially the hour hands. I think you know what I'm getting at. And even the pip of lume on the second hand, they could have just made it rectangular. I like that design, but they had to make it kind of trapezoid. I don't like that. But yeah, it's still a fairly reasonably good design. Now, in terms of the lume, well, not exactly the lume, but the use of yellow plots. Why? I don't understand why. It makes no sense to me. I wish they didn't use it. So in terms of the bracelet, these are very Oyster bracelet inspired links. The clasp is of course different. The taper is also different, but they're both 20mm, the Explorer 1 and the Tudor Ranger as well. So the Explorer 1, the bracelet construction, it's a bit more solid. It's more refined. It's everything that you use to differentiate Rolex and Tudor. Even though it's a discontinued and older watch, it's still better. So overall, did the Rolex Explorer 1 214-270 inspire the Tudor Ranger? Well, it sort of did, in the manner that it uses a very similar set of case dimensions, 39mm, almost the same lug-to-lug distance, 11mm thick. If you just take a look at the case profile, of course, dome crystal adds more on that, but it does feel thinner, since when it's on the wrist, you don't think about the thickness of the crystal as much. So yes, it kind of is a solution that Rolex Tudor intend to provide, because they discontinued the 39mm size. In terms of what this watch is based on fully, it's an amalgamation of different watches. The original Tudor Ranger was based on the Oyster prints that did the expedition stuff, but it was always meant to take after the Explorer. So the most original inspirations probably come from the 1016 or even earlier Explorers like the 6610. So the 1016 probably inspired a lot of the dial characteristics, and the size is inspired by the 39mm 214-270. The hands are kind of taken from the previous 34mm Tudor Ranger 7995. The T-fit is not inspired by anything. It's cool and brand new. The links themselves inspired by maybe the 14-270 Rolex Explorers. And the crystal is just black bay things. These are my thoughts and opinions. Of course, it's not word from Tudor saying that this is how they did it. It's just things that I'm connecting. I'd like to hear your thoughts about all of this. Put it in the comments below. Perhaps you have more insight, and that would be nice for everyone. So is this watch a successor to the Rolex Explorer 214-270? Absolutely not. That watch, when it retailed, was at least more than double this. That's also a Rolex. Tudor is really meant to take over the market below Rolex. And so for those reasons, no. And in today's grey market, that watch is 3 times as expensive, or maybe even more. So it's not the same customer, it's not the same successor, but there are a lot of people who are on the wait list for the 36mm Explorer right now, and maybe a few of them that do like larger watches would consider getting this just to have it in the meanwhile. Or maybe some of them would just be completely satisfied with this instead of that watch. But it's not an actual alternative. It's a very different size, and it wears differently to the 36mm 124-270. Thanks for watching. See you in the comments below. Cheers.